award this morning is the Hart Merriam Award, which honors outstanding contributions in research and mammalogy. Nominees typically are established scientists who are actively engaged in research and who have made significant contributions to the science of mammalogy over a period of at least 10 years. And many of them have been very active for much longer than that. A little background, Hart Merriam was born in New York in 1855. He began collecting mammals at a really young age. At the ripe age of 16, he was assigned to serve as the official naturalist on the 1872 Hayden Geologic Survey to the area of Yellowstone National Park, which is incredibly appropriate for today's speaker, who also happens to work quite a bit in and around Yellowstone. Merriam studied natural history and anatomy at Yale. Our current speaker today also went to Yale. Then studied medicine at Columbia. He worked as a practicing physician, but soon gave up on that and moved on to his actual passion. He became the first chief of the Division of Economic Ornithology and Mammalogy at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, later to be renamed the Bureau of Biological Survey. This is the predecessor of the National Wildlife Research Center, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, clearly an influential role to have assumed. Merriam also initiated the North American Fauna series and pursued extensive studies on the taxonomy and distribution of mammals. He developed the concept of life zones, which is basic stuff covered in every intro ecology course. Merriam oversaw many of the seminal surveys of birds and mammals throughout North America, and he's widely regarded as a leading figure in the natural sciences and the father of mammalogy as an academic discipline. Past recipients of this award are truly a who's who of research in mammalogy. To select any few would disparage the many others that we've awarded this for. So I'll merely note the names of recipients who've received this since 2010. These are Gerardo Ceballos, Jim Estes, Rudy Boonstra, Denise Deering, Bruce Patterson, and Joel Brown. It's a pretty lofty crowd indeed. The 2017 recipient of the Merriam Award is Dr. Mark Boyce from the University of Alberta. And again, much of the information on him is available in the program, so I'm not going to give a lot of detail, but just an outline. As I mentioned, he earned his PhD at Yale. He's held professorial titles at the University of Wyoming, University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and he's currently the Alberta Conservation Chair in Fisheries Wildlife at the University of Alberta. He's a fellow of the Wildlife Society. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's received abundant recognition for his contributions in science by multiple groups. His CV presents what one reviewer called staggering productivity. He's got 6 books, over 270 scientific publications, 112 of these since 2010 alone. The diversity of topics on which he's widely recognized as an authority is equally humbling. Ranges from the survival of small populations to the analysis of habitat requirements, the impacts of disturbances on survival, statistical analysis of environmental variability, how this influences population ecology, long-term persistence, and much more. He's written 2 annual review articles, both of which have been extensively cited in the literature. One reviewer noted that Dr. Boyce is, quote, a superb naturalist and mammalian ecologist who possesses a set of mathematical and statistical talents that few can equal, so that he sees theoretical ecology as a handmaiden of practical wildlife management. As if to rub it in, and this is me speaking now, as if to rub it in, he also works on really cool critters, very charismatic species, wolves, bears, elk, wolverines. I work with mice, for crying out loud. And his work has true impact. So he's kind of bridging the divide between core research and important conservation and management implications. I'll close with a comment from one of his letter writers, a globally renowned ecologist in his own right. Writing a letter in support of Dr. Boyce is truly difficult because his overall level of achievement is so extensive and so comprehensive that it's difficult to know even where to start, and much harder to know where to stop, for that matter. I'm deeply honored to present the 2017 recipient of the Hart Merriam Award, Dr. Mark Boyce. Got everything? Okay.
In 1926, Yellowstone National Park killed the last wolf, wiped them all out. They did a pretty good job of extirpating cougars as well. And then following that, the elk population increased substantially, so that during 1930s to 1968, the park deemed it necessary to cull elk within Yellowstone National Park to protect the vegetation, prevent overgrazing and overbrowsing of the vegetation. This received some consternation, both within and outside the park, and keep pushing the wrong button. And the question came up as to whether we really need to cull elk. And in 1967, I watched ABC Evening News when there was a documentary about the cull of elk in the park, and there was enormous political pushback because of this. And this led to a moratorium on the cull that was pushed largely by Gale McGee, who was the senator from Wyoming, and he convinced George Herzog, who was director of the National Park Service, and Stuart Udall, who was Secretary of Interior, that they needed to impose a moratorium to see if they couldn't find a better solution. Glenn Cole was the biologist in the park at the time, and he decided to put a positive spin on this and to call it the natural regulation experiment to see what would happen if we didn't cull elk in the park. And the population of elk grew to sizable numbers, almost 20,000 elk. So in response to some population modeling that I had done of elk in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, including publication of this book on the Jackson elk herd, and then Evelyn Merrill and I began some research on populations of elk in northern Yellowstone, I was coerced into developing models to see what would happen if wolves were reintroduced. And it was coincident with the 1988 fires that occurred in the park, and this is George Bush talking to John Varley. John Varley is the individual who twisted my arm and convinced me to do this exercise of modeling wolf reintroduction into the park. And little did I know that John had also contracted with Oz Garton and Jim Peake to do exactly the same thing. So we had dueling models. And after about a year, we got together and compared notes, and Oz and I did almost exactly the same thing. We had exactly the same data to work with, of course. The only thing that I spent more time on than he did was I included a lot of detail about stochastic variability and how variability would enter the system. And I had a really slick platform for my model as well, with an interactive model. And the guts of the model are here. It's basically a simple predator-prey model with 4 species of prey: elk, moose, bison, and mule deer, and density dependence, of course. This term being density dependence, and then a multi-species functional response. And then this is the equation for the wolves, and a key feature of this equation, of course, includes the cumulative abundance of alternative prey, but also a density-dependent term for the wolves. And I used a type 3 functional response. John Maynard Smith convinced me that this was a necessary structure for the model. This is Holling's type 3 functional response with a logistic shaped functional response for each of the prey. And this resulted in what I called the Wolf 5 model, included density dependence for the wolves, which I thought was a very commonsensical thing to include, and it turned out to be contentious for a while, but as we've seen what's happened in the park, it's not contentious anymore. In fact, it was borne out. Hunter harvest, we had really good basis for that, because Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks had published density-dependent criteria for how many licenses were going to be issued. And again, this is a stabilizing force, as is density dependence, that helps ensure the long-term persistence of the system. I included stochastic carrying capacity for the prey, driven by winter severity and summer forage, and studies that Evie and I had done documented how this worked. And what it meant is you never got the same result twice. So I made about 100 copies of this thing, and for the younger people in the audience, you've probably never seen one of these, but this is a 5 1/4 inch floppy, and so I made copies on these 5 1/4 inch floppies and distributed them to government offices and state and federal agencies, as well as to high schools in the region, and so that people could play with the model, and you could fiddle with alternative management actions to see what the consequences would be for the dynamics of the system. And the data that I had to go into the model were actually very extensive because of Houston's monograph that came out in 1982 on the northern Yellowstone elk herd that included details of density dependence for elk. But also Luke Harbin's work in Riding Mountain National Park, which was at the time the only system for which I could find data on the interactions between elk and wolves in the same system. And so Lou's work was also really very important in parameterizing the model. So in 1995, Yellowstone National Park initiated the most celebrated ecological experiment in history by releasing wolves into Yellowstone National Park. And for the next 10 years, I had students monitoring the details of what happened in terms of elk and wolves in particular. And looking at the first 10 years of data, the model did a really good job of characterizing what was going to happen. And so the little triangles here in this graph, this line here, are the average model predictions over a large number of runs. And then these squares are the actual numbers of elk that were counted over the next 10 years. And then these dashed lines are just a few runs to show you the range of variability in the projections. So it was easy to be smug about the results, but it was all wrong, because the guts were not consistent with what we had in the model. And for one thing, during the first 10 years, wolves killed at least 95% elk. We had much greater diversity of prey being used in the simulations in the model. And one of the more striking research results from those first 10 years was this paper by Gerald Wright and Rolf Peterson, showing the selection by wolves versus hunters of different age classes of elk. And you can see the yellow bars show the age distribution of animals killed by hunters, whereas the magenta-colored bars are the ones killed by elk. And note that killed by wolves. Elk killed by wolves tend to be either the young ones, the calves, or old-aged elk. Now the blue line shows the reproductive value, and reproductive value is the contribution that an individual has to population growth rate. And you'll note that the hunter-killed elk have much greater reproductive value, so the consequences of an elk killed by a hunter is much more substantial than the consequences of an elk killed by a wolf. But none of this was in the original model. The original model was too simplistic. And so Nathan Varley was a PhD student with me, and what he did was after these 10 years is to use all these data to go back and fix the model. And we included such things as the gory details of age and sex, as in this matrix model that has density-dependent vital rates. And we used that then to do new predictions of what will happen. But during the next 10 years, that is over the last decade, say, the system has just gotten more and more complicated. One of the big changes that we've documented over time is that grizzly bear predation on calves has become ever more an important factor in the dynamics of elk in Yellowstone National Park. In fact, throughout other regions of the Rocky Mountains as well. And a study by Barbara Meyer and Dave Meach, Wildlife Monograph, documented the extent to which this is happening. Francis Singer and I visited Gardner's Hole. This must have been 1996. And we saw a grizzly bear going back and forth through this meadow searching for elk calves. And they get really good at it. And the same grizzly bear would come back year after year to the same meadow at the same time looking for elk calves. And we actually documented that the females teach their cubs how to hunt for grizzly bear calves. And the mechanism by which this is transferred to the next generation is learning. But those areas that are traditional calving grounds get hit pretty hard. Another alternative predator that complicated the system was a gradually increasing cougar population. So as I mentioned earlier, we pretty well wiped out cougars 100 years ago. But gradually, their numbers began to increase, so that by the time wolves were reintroduced, there already were fair numbers of cougars in the park. And they kill about 75% elk. And they're very efficient predators, and they're fairly large in body size, and the numbers of cougars on the northern, in Yellowstone Park is about the same as the number of wolves on the northern range. So this shows the dynamics of actually what has happened over the last 23 years since wolf reintroduction. So 1995, the first wolves were released, and the red line here shows the wolf population increasing and then coming back, and then oscillating with the number of elk toward a long-term dynamic equilibrium. But another messy bit that we hadn't anticipated in the modeling was what was going on with bison. And bison numbers went from very low numbers relatively low numbers on the northern range to almost 4,000 bison today. In fact, with this year's crop of calves, there are over 4,000 bison on the northern range in Yellowstone National Park. Bison from the Pelican and from Hayden Valley have moved onto the northern range, onto the elk range. Now, exactly why this occurred possibly relates to competition with elk. With the reduced numbers of elk and increased forage for the bison have moved in and replaced the elk as grazers on the northern range. But what's going to happen in the future as it relates to bison, we don't have a clue. But another big part of this whole story, and the one that's been most celebrated in the literature and in BBC documentaries and other places that the public have picked up on, is this notion of a trophic cascade. And the trophic cascade, the common terminology of a cascade means that as elk numbers go up, as wolf numbers go up, elk numbers go down, and the vegetation increases. So it's up, down, up, down. And the mechanisms by which this has been hypothesized to occur include both density-mediated responses, meaning wolves kill elk, and that results in a reduction in elk numbers, or trait-mediated, meaning that the fear of wolves affects the distribution or foraging by elk, and where the elk are affecting the vegetation on the landscape. So it's wolves killing elk, and the primary plants that have received the most attention in this context would be willow, aspen, and cottonwood, woody plants that are heavily affected by browsing by elk, and clearly with high numbers of elk, the ability of these species to recruit and grow on, especially on the northern range, was substantially reduced. Willow browsing was and still is in some areas heavily affected by elk and by bison browsing in winter. We have high browsing rates in Yellowstone National Park, about 48%, taking about greater than 80% of the annual growth. But the variability is very high. So some stands are browsed very heavily, and other stands not so much. So Hawthorne Beyer was my student who studied the growth of willow across the northern range, at 17 sites across the northern range. And he did this by sectioning the stems and then measuring the amount of growth that occurred in each year. And so he could relate the growth of the willow to browsing pressure as well as to rainfall and snow depth and other covariates. And the outcome was quite striking, that wolf reintroduction happened in 1995 with the red arrows. So these are two species of willow, Salix boothii and Salix guyerana. And the most important thing to note here, of course, there's an increase in growth of willow after wolf reintroduction, but there's enormous variation. We have some sites where there's no change at all. The growth of willow is about the same. And there are some sites that continue to get clobbered every year. But there are other sites where the release from herbivory caused by fear or caused by changes in abundance of elk in different parts of the range has resulted in dramatic increases in willow. Browsing clearly affects the growth of the willow. Proportion of stems browsed is inversely related to growth of the willow. An interesting thing is that snow depth is also inversely related to growth of the willow. And the reason for that is that with snow cover, it makes the grasses less available to the grazers, and they hit the browse that sticks up above the snow harder. So you get heavier browsing pressure when there's deeper snow. Another important pattern in the browsing is this cumulative pattern and the timing. So everything is very seasonal, of course, in Yellowstone National Park, and this seasonality really makes a big difference. And it also makes a difference in how you interpret some of the literature that exists about the whole trophic cascade story in the park. The browsing really comes on in January, February, and doesn't reach its cumulative max until late February, March. But there are papers, for example, some of the Ripple papers, where the vegetation was being measured in September and October, which is before any of this browsing effect has happened. So again, the timing is so important to being able to interpret the results of these various projects. Back to this issue, though, of the spatial variation, I just show you a couple of sites. This is the Blacktail Plateau, which is just east of Mammoth. And you can see there's a bison in the middle, but you can see how the willow has grown up substantially in the blacktail. And this is one of the places where we've seen a substantial trophic cascade kind of response. But adjacent to the mammoth exclosure, which is just south of the village of Mammoth, the willow gets slicked off every year. And I visited this site in 1985 with Don Despain, and at that time, the density of willow stems was as high outside the exclosure as it was inside the exclosure. But bison and elk were slicking it off every year, and now those plants are dead and you don't get any resprouting at all anymore. But some areas are still very heavily hit by grazing and browsing, depending upon the spatial distribution of the ungulates during the winter. A new paper just came out by Rose and Cooper showing that cottonwoods are rebounding. And I thought cottonwoods were toast. I mean, most of the cottonwood stands look like the trees in this photo, old trees, and there was virtually no regeneration because they'd been hit by browsing pressure, for one thing. But also, what Rose and Cooper showed was that flooding events have a huge effect on the ability of cottonwood to regenerate. We currently have 1.37 million cottonwoods in Yellowstone National Park as a response to flooding events that occurred over the last decade, about 2008 being a peak year. And so there's hope that we will actually have cottonwoods in the future. Some really interesting experimental studies were done by Tom Hobbs on the Northern Range in the Blacktail area with experiments to simulate the effects of beavers as well as browsing. And beavers are key elements of this system. Beavers were pretty well eliminated during this period of abundant elk numbers, but they've been coming back. And so Tom created artificial dams, and he then put exclosures in places where the hydrology was affected by the dams and in the places where it wasn't. And these were artificial beaver dams. And then they measured the height and biomass accumulation of individually marked stems of willow. And this shows the results that the control area where nothing was done, there's insufficient growth for the willow to be able to maintain. If you have a dam, but it's a fenced area, if there's no dam, but it's a fenced area, you get an increase in the growth of willow. If it's dammed and there's no fence, you get an even bigger response, but of course, the best is if it's dammed and fenced so that herbivory is eliminated, as well as improved hydrology. This slide actually shows it better than the data, where you can see on the right is a control site that's relatively drier, and pretty well herbivory takes all of the willow off of that site. In the middle, you can see an exclosure that's in an area where the hydrology is affected by the dams, and the herbivory is excluded, and so you get robust growth of willow there. And on the left, it's a dam site, but without a fence, so sort of intermediate. So we had an extensive GPS radio telemetry study on elk. We hired bighorn helicopters to capture elk and put radio collars on the elk. We actually contracted this work done. I've been along with them. It's terrifying, and it saves the risk factor for my students. But this shows some of Julie Mao's work. So Julie did the early telemetry work, And when we started, we were using VHF collars, which meant that she had to fly once or twice a week to relocate the elk. But we then went to GPS collars that were so much nicer because it reduced the amount of flying. But Julie did a couple years of flying at least once a week. And this shows wolf utilization distributions on the northern range during the breeding season. So they start finding dens in late February, but they're tied to the dens then. Wolves are tied to the dens during March through July. And that restricts their movements to areas around the den. I mean, they can go considerable distances, and they do to forage, but there's a concentration of activity around the dens. And what Julie observed was that there's sort of halos of elk activity surrounding these den sites where the elk were avoiding areas of high wolf utilization. So we studied this in more detail, looking at each year from wolf reintroduction up through 10 years. And you can see that these being wolf pack territories on the northern range, and you can see during the first 4 or 5 years that there are interstitial spaces between the wolf territories. And that's where we were finding elk, and that's where elk were being killed, was in those interstitial spaces. But then after that, so starting about year 2000 or 2001, the entire northern range was chock-a-block full of elk, of wolf territories, and there was no place else for the elk to go, and so they were unable to escape. And so although we could document a behavioral response during the first few years, as the landscape filled up with wolves, it's not possible anymore, and so then it became more of a numerical response instead of the ability to see the behavioral response on the part of the elk. The story has just been made more complex. There was an ecological monograph that came out last week by Cole et al., showing that we see differences during the time of day. And so wolves are highly crepuscular in their activity, and the threat to elk is greatest during these crepuscular periods, and that's when they shift their use of habitats during the time of day associated with the threat of wolf activity. So we studied these GPS radio collar data in some detail and developed a new method for analysis of telemetry data that we call step selection analysis. So we start with a landscape, and we simplify that into maps, patches, and you can see the little cartoon of an elk in the middle of that left here, and then we record where that elk goes, and we need 3 relocations because it takes 3 to get a turning angle to characterize how they're moving. So we have step lengths in the lower graph, and then turning angles in the upper graph. And the combination of step lengths and turning angles allows us to make predictions about where they might have gone. And so these red lines are alternative paths that they might have taken, steps that they might have taken, but they actually took that black one. And so then what we could do is use conditional logistic regression to contrast the selected step with alternative steps that they might have taken, and relate that to these various predictor covariates, the topography and aspen and conifer and so forth. And so Danielle Fortin estimated elk step selection functions for the northern range in Yellowstone, and related that to an index of wolf distribution. And in areas where wolf concentrations were high, they tended to take steps out of aspen stands. They were avoiding aspen stands, and they were moving into either black timber, meaning conifer stands, the dotted line on top. They were either moving into black timber or into open areas where they could see wolves approaching. And so Danielle's, or our interpretation of those results were that aspen stands can be very dangerous places for elk because wolves can get up on them, and so therefore they're avoiding these stands, even though they're highly preferred as foraging areas. This is probably the most controversial area in this whole business of trophic cascades right now, is what's going on with the aspen. I think the willow story is pretty good, and the cottonwood one is amazing, but the aspen one, we're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on, because the aspen are still getting hit really hard by the elk. And so it's highly preferred areas for foraging in winter. It may relate to the fact that every aspen stand's a little different, and some of them are easy to see a wolf approaching and other ones not. It may also relate to the fact that predator-prey dynamics are always temporally and spatially dynamic, and the fact that maybe herbivory is happening at times of day that we were unable to document in our earlier study. But at any rate, we don't understand exactly what's going on here. The aspen story is still an ongoing one, but the trophic cascade is not particularly contentious, I don't think, at the moment. Outside the park, however, it's a totally different story. Dave Meach wrote a paper about questioning whether science was sanctifying the wolf, meaning that the hype over the trophic cascade story in Yellowstone National Park was meaning that that people were proposing that wolves needed to be reintroduced everywhere, Scotland, for example, and Iowa and other places where they might not get on very well, but if you look at areas outside Yellowstone National Park, this trophic cascade story isn't there at all, in that livestock biomass is much greater than wild ungulates on most western rangelands, and hunters alter the distribution and abundance of wild ungulates. So our ability to generalize from these studies in national parks needs to be dealt with cautiously. Andrea Morehouse, a graduate student of mine, monitored radio-collared wolves in southwestern Alberta, so it's straight north of Yellowstone Park, but in an area of intensive agriculture, but in an area where the prairies abut the mountains very abruptly, and so we have wilderness areas, we have forest reserves with large populations of wild ungulates and predators right next to intensive agricultural areas. And in that area, she found 45% of the prey detected by clusters of GPS relocations. Doug, I thought you were supposed to call this off when it I'm almost done, but I had a couple more comments to make here. You can hear me? Yeah, I'll just charge on. So 45% of the prey that she detected based on these GPS clusters were cattle, domestic cattle. 75% of the biomass of the prey in this area were cattle. It's not surprising that ranchers hate wolves. It's not surprising that 100 years ago we wiped them out from agricultural landscapes in North America. And Tyler Muley did a path analysis decomposing components of this system, showing how humans alter forage quality and quantity. They plant alfalfa and they manage pastures, and that results in an increase in cattle production, an increase in elk production, actually an increase in wolves. But then the humans, of course, are killing wolves and causing their numbers to go down. But humans are having a consequence to these landscapes that would appear very much bottom up, as opposed to allowing the large carnivore influences to play out the way that they do in a national park. So what have we learned in the Yellowstone studies? Trophic level interactions are inherently dynamic in time and space. We knew that. I mean, you learn that in population ecology, that predator-prey systems have the ability to be dynamic in their behavior. There's enormous site variation in browsing pressure, soils, moisture, composition of the vegetation, topography, and that contributes to the huge variation that we're seeing in this trophic cascade. And we have both numerical and behavioral responses. I think that the consensus today is that the behavioral responses are much less than the numerical responses. But early on, when wolves were first reintroduced, we were able to see these behavioral responses more markedly than we are today. Today, it's more of a numerical response. But again, to amplify one of my punchlines here, trophic cascades increase the spatial and temporal variability in the system. And if there's one really striking result, I think, from the Yellowstone studies, it's this one. But in the big picture, parks serve as ecological baseline reserves, and this is extremely important from the standpoint of what we've learned from the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone National Park. And the Starker-Leopold report of 1963, examining how we should be managing wildlife in our national parks, made this point about how important it is that we have national parks and that we manage them with ecological process management, trying to minimize human influence so we can see what happens in places where we're not modifying the landscape, where human intervention is so dramatic. That large carnivores and their influence on the system need to be allowed to let rip. Beavers need to be allowed to do their ecosystem engineering across the landscape with their huge consequences for variability in the system. Fire is now, I think, managed well under the prescribed natural fire policy of the federal government. So when fires can burn, they're allowed to burn. But my biggest fear about the future of ecological process management in Yellowstone relates to bison. And science can't predict exactly what's going to happen with the big changes that are happening in bison right now. But there are political forces that seem to think that they understand what needs to happen and how we need to be managing the system, even though ecologists can't predict it. I mean, the big message coming from all of the wolf work is that there's so much that we've learned about the complexity of this system, and it's been such a wonderful rollout over the last 25 years of how the system works and how large carnivores shape the assemblage of species and distribution and abundance of species and affect ecosystem function and process. And in fact, if anything, that's probably one of the most powerful changes in conservation biology that we've witnessed in recent years, is this appreciation for the role of large carnivores. So in context of bison, I think that we as scientists need to do everything that we can to convince the National Park Service that they need to maintain their policy of ecological priority, ecological process management for the crown jewel of the national park system, Yellowstone National Park. Thanks very much for the opportunity, and great thanks to my students who have done the work, and the various collaborators and funding agencies who've supported me, and I'm very grateful for the honor of receiving the C. Hart Merriam Award. Thank you.
We're running a little bit late, but I would like to open up for a couple of questions because this was a fascinating topic, and I know that we've got an authority here. If anyone has any questions. Jake.
So, you've worked in this system for a long time, and you just highlighted all of the nuance and complexity that surround the trophic cascade, particularly with respect to wolves, elk, and aspects. And I'm wondering, in light of that complexity, why you think the general public and many in the scientific community have wanted to paint with a very broad brush as to what predators do to their almost always trigger these trophic cascades, when in fact there's a lot of context dependence. And I'm curious as to philosophically why you think that is.
I think that the scientific community has maybe oversold it a little bit, and the media has made hay with it. And there are some amazing examples, illustrations. I mean, Soda Butte Creek up along the Lamar Road, the willow are 12 feet tall, and you've got yellow warblers, you've got beavers in the area, you've got a change in the ecosystem that's visible and dramatic. You go to the next drainage over, and it's one that gets clobbered year after year, and so it's no different than it was 25 years ago. But you know, details about topography and vegetation and hydrology make all the difference. But so it is more complex. That doesn't minimize in any way the beautiful results showing trophic cascade, and I think that those warrant our celebration. But as I pointed out, then generalizing that that we'll be successful at reintroducing wolves into Scotland, for example, maybe. I think sheep herders have a different idea. But I mean, wolves are in conflict. Large carnivores in general are in conflict with human agricultural programs, and we've got to resolve how to deal with those kinds of interactions to be able to make use of the trophic cascade phenomenon more broadly, I think. We have to be cautious. Yeah.
Don?
So mine's a little different than Jake's question. It's how do we deal with that in terms of dealing with the public and the bigger system? Because obviously, for most of us, if we study a system very long, we know it's got lots of complexity and nuance. This happens to be one that has lots of human interaction and lots of important ecosystem dynamics. So how do we make that more digestible and keep most of the meaningful pattern that we see, but make it possible for non-scientists to really be able to interpret?
You know, I don't think that the story is that complicated. Maybe I'm too close to it, but I think that we can explain it reasonably well, and maybe we just need to do a more cautious job of it. One of the programs that's been very successful in recent years in the West has been working with ranchers to find ways to coexist with large carnivores. And this program has been particularly successful in the Waterton Lakes Glacier National Park area, where they use electric fencing, they use fladry, they encourage ranchers to bring livestock into the buildings for calving season. They hire range riders when they have cattle in the back country, so they'll hire a high school kid to ride range for the summer, a dream job for a high school, and it's very effective. I mean, if you've got a range rider with your cattle, almost no losses. So there are things that can be done to allow us to coexist with large carnivores, and one of the arguments is that if you're going to be grazing livestock on public lands in an area where there are large carnivores, you've got to figure out how to deal with it. And Alberta has a policy that if you do have a conflict, you're welcome to take matters into your own hands and shoot elk or shoot wolves or poison them or whatever, but they no longer actually do it for the ranchers and put more of the onus on them to deal with it.
One last question, then we're going to have to call it. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask the anti-predator strategy for elk. Like, I would imagine when the wolves were reintroduced in 1995, the bison would be better adapted to dealing with wolves, but I don't think the elk would be that well adapted. So I'm just wondering, how do they defend their young? Or what strategies do elk use to avoid that?
They get eaten. So there is a big difference, though, and bison are dangerous prey. And bison do defend their calves aggressively. Actually, yearling bison are perhaps the most vulnerable to wolf predation. But because there are still good numbers, there are about 8,000. The count this year was about 8,000 elk on the northern range. There are still good numbers of elk, and wolves will take elk rather than bison because bison are dangerous prey. But they do take bison, and there are places like Wood Buffalo National Park where there aren't any elk, and wolves take bison. And so it may be that there will be more learning, more interaction between bison and wolves in the future. We presume that that's almost certainly going to be happening if we allow the system to continue on.
I'd like to thank our speakers, and for the moment, especially Mark Boyce, for an outstanding presentation. And walking down the hall with this this morning, I had more than a few people say, "I'll take that." This is the celebrated Bison Hart Merriam Award 2017, Mark S. Boyce. We have no further fancy discussion on here, but this is the Bison Award for you. Congratulations and thank you so very much.